So welcome everyone. Welcome to this our lecture, as it were, on the events of Holy Week. And I just wanted to take a few moments just to kind of gather ourselves. We'll start with a moment of prayer. God, as we gather in your name to explore the mysteries of faith, we give thanks for your presence amongst us. That through the exploration of the meaning of your word and how your word was shaped by the world around it, we may have new insights, new understandings, and new visions of your faith. We try to be faithful to what was proclaimed, but at the same time understand that those documents were shaped by forces beyond our control. So we pray that you be with us in this time of sharing information and with some time to share some questions afterwards. Amen. So what are we doing here? Am I undermining the basis of Christianity as per usual, or are we taking an opportunity to explore the larger story, as it were? As we talked about this theme, the kind of the gap between historical reality and as much as we can discern what that historical reality is of the events of Holy Week, with what I've referred to as the hero narratives created by the Gospels. What do I mean by hero narrative? Well, the narrative of the hero is one of the oldest story tropes in human history. The idea of the hero, an individual, predominantly in the past was male, who through a series of encounters will receive blessings and gifts that will establish a boon for the rest of humanity. There's been a whole variety of studies and research into that theme. And so the overall arc is the gap between what probably happened and what the Gospels want you to believe happened. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So I'm going to start off with what I refer to as historical reality. What is that? What does it mean to kind of rather grandiosely say, here is the historical facts? Well, first of all, good luck in that. We don't have much in the way of facts. The ancient world has not left us much evidence as we obviously would like. One of the things that sometimes is difficult for people to grasp is that Jesus was not as important as we like to think he was at that time. And it's the other side of the coin is like, I always find it amusing when I see these people, usually this time of year, we often see stories like this, of people who will rather grandiosely say or pretentiously say, there's no evidence to show that Jesus existed. Really? We have these Gospels, we have these books, something did happen. Jesus did exist. What we know of him has went through a whole variety of sources and whatever, but to say that this individual was created out of people's imagination to promote a particular belief system is stretching the bounds of credibility. Now, it is very fair to say that much of what people associate with Jesus has no basis in what Jesus actually did. Much of North American Christian activism evolves around various opposing things like homosexuality, same-sex marriage, abortion, a whole variety of topics, transphobia, that Jesus did not say one word about. Not one word. And yet, apparently you can use Jesus's name to evoke the suppression of the trans community and whatever. So anyway, so what I am saying is there is an historical kernel. There is an historical reality. We can recreate that to an extent. Part of that is using the documentation that we have and being careful in discerning that documentation. discerning what we can establish as an historical fact and what we have to be more careful about. Our historical documents are from the Second Testament. And if we want to talk specifically about Jesus, our documents are the Second Testament, the letters of Paul and the Gospels. But what is also very useful is to know the context of the Roman Empire, the context of what it means, what Roman authority was like, what Jesus was up against, as it were. And that can certainly help to establish the historical reality of what Jesus operated within and how that historical reality can clash with what the Gospels try to tell us. And that's something we'll be definitely looking at later. And Pontius Pilate in particular is a very good example of the clash between historical reality and what the Gospels try to tell you. The historical reality of Pontius Pilate is very different from the vision of in the Gospels, and we'll look at that later. So, what is the earliest pieces of information we have about the events of Holy Week? They come from the letters of Paul. Paul wrote his letters between 25 to 35 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. He is not an eyewitness. He is part of a faith community. He will have learned the details about Jesus from people around him, from the early Christians. They would have told him stories. At one time, I mentioned charming little theories. There was someone who liked to throw out the idea that maybe Paul was part of the group that helped to arrest Jesus. There's no proof for that whatsoever. What you could point to is that Paul himself obviously had a strong sense that he had began as a persecutor of the Christian movement. There's a strong sense of guilt driving his actions and his conversion. And it maybe it'll be the case that he was there on the night of Jesus being arrested. There's nothing to say he wasn't. It's certainly safe to say that if he had been part of that group arresting Jesus, he would no rush to tell anyone else about it afterwards. That's so. But there's no proof. But if you want to have a look at that, that's fine. But Paul is the first person to write down details. Well, he's the first person who's writing down of the details of the last week we have. And he mentions the Last Supper. And the way he talks about the Last Supper is as like an established part of the life of the church community. This is like maybe 30 years, 25, 30 years after the crucifixion. That is already established as one of the central parts of worship, that they are remembering that on the night he was betrayed, Jesus shared a last meal. Does that count as an historical fact? Well, I think it does. It's written down. There's no reason for Paul to have made up this story. I think Paul is sharing, particularly in the context. The reason he tells this story is to criticize the modern day Corinthians, to show them they're doing it wrong. So I think there's a good argument to be made that he is relating what happened in the first place to say to the Corinthians, this is what you're doing wrong. So we can take that as an historical fact. There was a Last Supper. And I think that part of that conversation, Jesus was betrayed. We believe it was Judas Iscariot because of what the Gospels tell us. Paul doesn't mention the name, but with Paul, remember, Paul is not showing an historical narrative. What Paul is saying at this point, this is what happened. These are the details. This is why you're doing it wrong. The other detail is the crucifixion itself. Paul is the first person, once more, who's written it down that says that Jesus was crucified. And when this is one there's criteria we often use in historical discussions. If an event is embarrassing to the people who are sharing the story, then there's a very good chance it did happen. And Paul talks about the embarrassment in many ways, is maybe not the right word, but probably I think it's a very good word. The embarrassment of the fact that Jesus was crucified, because it made no sense. To the earlier followers of Jesus, it would have made no sense, particularly the Jewish followers, that the Messiah would meet such a death. So, Paul is the first person to write down some bits and pieces, but not in a coherent narrative. It's not a story. He's just relating some details because he needs these details to back up his arguments and whatever. The first person who wrote down the story of the events of Holy Week, of the Passion leading up to the crucifixion and the empty tomb, was Mark. Mark is the first of the gospel writers. Mark is the source gospel for Matthew and Luke. John may have known of Mark's, well, probably did know of Mark's gospel. I don't know how much he used Mark's gospel for writing his gospel, but there's not many links between Mark and John, unlike Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source material and then add in more information to meet their particular needs and agendas. So Mark is the first one. Is Mark an eyewitness? The general consensus is that he is not an eyewitness. The general consensus is that he is writing down the gospel from a collection of sources that have been floating around within the Christian community, maybe some written documents, some oral tradition, but he's the one who's the first one that we know of who brings it all into this narrative, as we will look at later, this hero's narrative. Now, that being said, and I shared this on the Facebook page, but and it's in my notes here, there is, I like to think of it as a charming little theory that may point to the possibility that Mark himself might be a possible eyewitness to the events of Holy Week, particularly in the events in the garden. It's from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verses 51 to 52. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. We don't know who that young man was. I came across a theory that suggested it was Mark. I liked it. I've decided to embrace it. I don't know. There's no real evidence one way or another. There's just some little bits and pieces which I'll use as an example of how historical evidence works. Matthew and Luke use Mark's gospel as a source, and sometimes word for word. So when they don't include something from Mark, that should make you curious, should make you even suspicious. What was wrong with that particular piece that they didn't want to do? Usually if they have a problem with Mark, they don't omit it. They add on something to change the meaning. They expand on what Mark said. So for example, the resurrection scenes is a very good example. Mark's original resurrection scene didn't cut the mustard. So Matthew and Luke in particular added more details to make it a more dramatic hero story, whereas Mark's ending is not a heroic ending. So that's how it works. If they completely omit something, that makes you, and neither Matthew nor Luke mention this young man. He doesn't exist in their narratives. And it may well be the case, and this is what I work with. It may well be the case that they did not want to give Mark more authority over them by pointing out that Mark may have been an original eyewitness. That maybe they didn't want Mark's version to be the official version of the Gospels because he had authority as an eyewitness. Now, Can't back that up. I just have a gut feeling about it with bits and pieces. And so if you know, with all historical evidence, there is a lot of your own feeling behind it. So, possibility that Mark is an eyewitness to some of the events of Holy Week, but we can't push that too far. So, what is the history of? What is the historical events? To strip it down to its bare minimum, what we can say, looking at the gospel narratives, looking at the historical narratives, looking at historical context, looking at what we know about the people involved, like Pontius Pilate, the historical record of Pontius Pilate exists in other sources and whatever, I can give you what I feel is a fairly accurate historical narrative that can be rooted into the history of the period. I believe that at some point Jesus enters into the city of Jerusalem. Does he enter in a procession like Palm Sunday? I think there's a good chance of it, because I think what's happening is Jesus is coming into Jerusalem to make a point. Jesus is acting like the prophets of the First Testament, using symbolism and imagery to make a point. In this case, he is proclaiming the kingdom of God that is in stark opposition to the reality of Roman power and the collaborationist authorities in Jerusalem. To make the point, a procession into Jerusalem. As some, because it would happen roughly at the same time as the Romans were coming in. The Romans would come in military formation. This was one of the few times that Roman troops were stationed in Jerusalem because of the fear of civil unrest. We know there was civil unrest recently. Barabbas, who is mentioned as one of the characters of the story, he is brought in as someone who's part of a recent insurrection. We don't know if it was just like bandit activity, terrorism, or whatever. But civil unrest was an ongoing problem. Roman troops are brought into Jerusalem during Passover because this is a holiday of heightened religious sensibilities. The liberation of the people of Israel from the domination of Pharaoh is going to have a lot of resonance to a population under the control of Rome and its collaborationist allies. So, Roman troops are there. Did Jesus do something in the temple? Probably. There's a very good chance that this is the incident that will make him a marked man. That something happened, and when he was acting within the kind of the historical narrative of the people of Israel, that the prophets of the First Testament would often do gestures that would explain to the people that God had noticed what was going on, God was paying attention, and God was not happy about a certain chain of events. That the temple had become a center of commercial exploitation. The temple was a tourist attraction. There was a whole, like, to come back to one of the phrases from John Dominic Crossing, he refers to ferocious ambiguity. And I think in many ways that will describe what Jesus's motivation is. The temple is the center of the religious connection between God and the people of Israel, and yet it is also profoundly tainted by its nexus of collaboration with Rome. That Jesus went into the temple complex and did something to get people's attention about the coming kingdom of God. I do feel that's the historical event that will lead to his arrest. Why does it take some time to find Jesus and arrest him? The Roman military didn't have the resources of identifying people. They didn't know how to get a hold of Jesus right off the bat. He'd have disappeared into the crowds. Jerusalem, the population in Jerusalem at that point would have been thousands, hundreds of thousands. This was a time of heightened celebration of Passover, heightened awareness of the gap between the message of Passover and the reality of Roman control. everyone's tense. Now, I think it's useful to remember that none of Jesus's actions have any real chance of undermining Roman control. Jesus is not going to bring down the Roman Empire by upsetting some money changers in the temple. That doesn't matter. Jesus has made himself a threat. The threat to the Roman peace is snuffed out, particularly when you're not that important. Jesus is a Jewish peasant, probably a landless peasant, as we've said in the past, employed as a laborer. He has no real power, no real, he has the power of his word. He has his power of being able to stir people's imagination, but he has no money, he has no armies, he has nothing. So he's not that important. So they can do to him whatever they want to. There's not going to be any repercussions. And it may well be the case, to come back to the historical record of Pontius Pilate, was that he may well have been looking for someone to nail to a cross. That Pontius Pilate was very much of the mindset of a typical Roman official in this region, that you keep the people in line through fear and state terror. The whole point of crucifixion is it's an act of state terrorism. A person is nailed or tied to a cross and left to die. The remains are kept on the cross. They are not taken down. They are kept there as a continual reminder to the rest of the population that if you mess with Rome, there's always space for you on a cross. Pontius Pilate may have already been looking for someone to nail to a cross. To say to everyone else, knock it off, don't bother, Rome's in charge. Now there's the question of the involvement of the Jewish authorities in all of this. This is a very challenging situation because one of the unfortunate realities is that the events of Holy Week have led to, are foundational to the origins of Christian anti-Judaism. That one of the strongest false charges against Judaism is that they were responsible for the death of Jesus, the term Christ killers. This has been part of the church as an institution for centuries. I remember reading the history of the church, particularly in some regions in Europe, where one of the Good Friday customs was to find a local Jew, bring them into the Catholic Church, and have him beaten as part of the liturgy, because he represented the Christ killers. So we have this theological legacy that stems from an event. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, how much of it is historical and how much of it is theological and how much of it is just lies? Did the Jewish leadership, what was the involvement of the Jewish leadership in the death of Jesus? Historically, we can point to a couple of details that make it clear, from my perspective at least. It was a Roman execution. If the Jewish authorities, and these are not the regular Jewish leadership. Well, the Jewish authorities we're talking about are a group of members of the temple elite, the clergy, their families and supporters. These were Hellenized Jews. Jews have been very much part of the Jewish-Greek connection. They were wealthy because they had established relationships with the Romans and had benefited from those experiences. So we're talking about a small section of the elite. We're not talking about the Pharisees, for example. The Pharisees would not be part of this conversation. The Essenes and all the other Jewish groups. This is the ruling elite of collaborationists. These were people whose ancestors had collaborated with the Greeks, and probably some of them collaborated with the Persians before. They're part of that long, noble tradition of elites who managed to find their way to keep their power and wealth when someone else takes over. Are they representative of the Jewish community? Well, they're Jewish, but in terms of what was going on with the people, the Pharisees and all the other factions and whatever, their alignment was more with Rome. What did they actually do? They may have supplied the Romans with some information about Jesus' location. We don't know. The Gospels tell us that they managed to find, they managed to establish a connection with Judas and persuaded Judas to betray Jesus. It could well be that, one of the names Iscariot is very close to the term Sicarii, and Sicarii was a terrorist group that operated within the period of this time. They carried flick knives, and they would go into the crowd and kill off collaborators. They didn't kill Romans because they knew if they killed Romans, then Rome would clamp down. Maybe the Romans recognized Judas, gave him, didn't give him a choice. They said, either you collaborate with us or we nail you to a cross. Maybe someone in the Jewish leadership knew of Judas's background. We don't know. What we do know is, historically, the details make it clear that this was a Roman execution. Even the charge was the Romans saying to the Jewish community, we are going to crucify your king of the Jews, just to remind you there's no such thing as a king of the Jews. They may have cooperated, this Jewish leadership may have cooperated with Jesus, with Rome. Not because they saw Jesus as a threat, but more likely because they saw that if they didn't hand over Jesus, the Romans would kill more people. Pontius Pilate had a well-established track record of killing innocent civilians to make a point. Whatever involved, and the Jewish authorities didn't like what Jesus had to say. They were not keen on his kingdom of God, not by any stretch of the imagination. But at the same time, they would, and they would be happy to get rid of him. But if they had wanted to really get rid of him permanently, they could have organized his death. Sicarii could have killed him, whatever. He could have been killed in a mob. They had options. In fact, interesting enough, we see this in the book of Acts. The first martyr is killed by a mob, whipped up by the Jewish leadership, supposedly. Why didn't they do that for Jesus? We don't know. So I personally, from looking at the historical context, looking from the historical bits and pieces, I think that the Jewish authorities would not have been that involved. That they may have given some information, they may have said to people, keep an eye out for this Jesus fellow. There may have been some kind of intelligence gathering, but when it comes to the actual main event, the arrest, prosecution, and execution, it was all part of the Roman process of enforcing Roman peace. And this is very much odds, as we hear in the Gospels later. So that's these are the events. Jesus does something in Jerusalem. He gets the attention of Rome. He is arrested, prosecuted, and executed by Rome. And then the next historical detail, which, spoiler alert, the tomb is empty. I very much believe this is an historical event because of the nature of how Mark tells the story. As I've mentioned in the past, historical evidence is often based on who your witnesses are. And the fact that Mark uses witnesses who are women to tell the story of the tomb being empty, I think is a very strong indication that that's an historical fact. Especially when you look at the fact that the other Gospels add on extra details to almost buttress up the claim. The women saw the tomb, but don't worry, so did Peter, as we hear in Matthew and look in the others. So the tomb was empty. Beyond that, in terms of history, we can't really establish anything, except for, as some historians will point out, and then as an historian, I'm in this camp. What you can point out to was the profound transformation in the survivors after the execution of Jesus. Something happened to them that renewed their vision of the kingdom of God, and not just renewed it, but transformed it. That they finally, they finally get it. They finally understand what the kingdom of God is all about. So, as an historical piece of evidence, the followers of Jesus were transformed by some event that led them to hit the road and start proclaiming the good news. What that event was, they would have told you it was the resurrection of Jesus. History can't prove that per se, because we don't have independent attestation from other folks. But we can look at the impact of something happening to these people. So there's your historical facts. Jesus does something, comes into the city. Something happens in the temple. There is a little bit of time, couple of days between, figuring what to do with it. He organizes a last meal that seems to be very much on the premise of something is going to happen. I'm going to do this in remembrance of what happened. This is going to be an event celebrating the life, death, and resurrection, or life and death. And then Jesus is arrested and executed as a threat to the Roman peace. And the tomb is empty. That's your historical connections. Now let's look at the how the history becomes the hero narrative in the Gospels. And I'm going to look at a couple of scenes that kind of illustrate the point I'm going to make. One of the scenes that I'm going to talk about is the crowd, the leaders, and Barabbas. And I'm going to talk a bit more about Pontius Pilate and all this, and his role. The crowd scene, where the crowd is supposedly given a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, is probably a fiction. There is no historical record of the Romans offering a Passover amnesty to someone. And I think it is very unlikely that the crowd would have been given a choice. If even such a thing did happen, the Romans were not going to hand over back to the crowd someone who had committed acts of violence. So what's the point? Why do we have this story? And I think we might want to take a few moments to step back, is the historical perspective once again. We have this vision of the arrest of Jesus and his trial and all this kind of stuff being a big deal, a big event. We have, the Gospels, have this idea of the leadership all being involved in the factions, whatever. First of all, most of the Jewish leadership would not be involved, period, because they're getting ready for Passover. That's what their concern is: getting ready for Passover, getting ready for any potential crowd control issues, making sure things work out, making sure they've got the lamb, all the logistical details. The last thing they're going to worry about is some Galilean rebel who's just about to be nailed to a cross because he's managed to upset the Romans. That's way down in their list of priorities. To put it frankly, they didn't care. We have this vision of the whole world caring, the whole world's there, though everyone's looking in this, then again, I've talked about time travelers, and I often have this vision of this, a time traveler coming back to see the arrest of Jesus and the execution and expecting to have this whole palaver about it, and to be really disappointed when what probably happened was Jesus is arrested, he's brought in front of an official of the Roman government. The Roman government looks at him, says, yeah, next execution. There's no long-winded trial. There's no backwards and forwards of who's responsible for jurisdiction or whatever. Jesus is not important enough. He's a peasant. His family probably don't even have land. He's only one step away from being a slave. He doesn't have due process. He doesn't have all these rights that He probably never even saw Pontius Pilate. The whole process was probably some harried official who's probably looked at, just get it done and get it over with. He doesn't care, another Galilean Jew nailed to a cross, plenty of them already. That's the historical reality. Instead, the Gospels want to create this hero's narrative where Jesus is the center of everything that's going on. So we have this whole scene of crowds, the amnesty, picking who, do we pick Jesus or Barabbas? It's all to enhance the heroic narrative of Jesus. Mark is the one who is the first one to talk about the story. And Mark talks of the crowd. What is Mark trying to say? And this is my theory. The theory that I have is Mark is trying to make a point about humanity. They pick Barabbas because he's the man of action. He's more like the Messiah they were expecting, like a King David going out and killing the enemy. Free the land from the Romans for the sword and fire. He's a traditional action hero. Whereas Jesus is the Messiah. No, we don't get it. Matthew's expands on that, but Matthew has a more darker turn. Matthew has this Jewish leadership organizing the mob. So to specifically ask for Jesus' death. And then he really enhances more of his, the kind of the wishy-washiness of Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate, I don't want to do this. He's innocent. The idea that Pontius Pilate would have thought 5 seconds about the innocence, quote unquote, of a Jewish rebel is ludicrous, considering he had slaughtered. Even in the Gospels, like just in the recent Gospel readings, we talked about how Pontius Pilate had ordered the death of a bunch of people in Galilee, and it was pretty obvious some of them were innocent, and he didn't care. We hear this in the Gospel of Luke. So even in the Gospels themselves, they undermine this vision of Pontius Pilate being this kind of, I don't want to be responsible for the death of Jesus. He didn't care. He probably didn't even know who Jesus, he might have got a report afterwards saying we executed this guy called Jesus, son of Mary, from some hick town called Nazareth. You thought you might want to know. Yeah, whatever. What's for dinner tonight? I'm being flipped, but that's probably more the mindset of what was going on with Pontius Pilate. But to get back to Matthew, Matthew creates this vision of the crowd being whipped up by the Jewish leadership so that they will pick Barabbas. And then he has this extraordinary line that says, let his blood be upon us. We only hear that line in Mark. That they are happy to be responsible for the death of Jesus. And once more, this feeds into the later Christian anti-Judaism. That the Jews were ecstatic about being responsible for the death of Jesus. There's no historical evidence for that whatsoever. But for what we have with with Matthew, is the desire to have the Jews, this particular group of Jews, responsible for the death of Jesus. Because Matthew speaks on behalf of the Jewish Christians who believed that Jesus was the Messiah they had been waiting for, in opposition to the other Jewish groups who said, no, he wasn't. Matthew is using the historical events of the crucifixion to make a point about what was going on at that time within his own community, with profoundly unfortunate consequences. This is one of these moments when you can see the foundations of Christian anti-Judaism. Luke has this complicated backwards and forwards of of Pontius Pilate talking to the forces in Galilee and all this kind of stuff. And once more, it's almost ridiculous. This idea that these people the client king of Rome, Pontius Pilate, the Jewish leadership, who are all getting ready for Passover once more. To remind folks, Passover is what's, but they would take time out of their busy schedules to talk about the fate of some Jewish peasant. There's plenty more where they came from. Like, this idea, as we hear in Luke, these conversations, backwards and forwards, and, like, who's responsible for it? Like, so why? Luke once more wants to establish the importance of Jesus. Not just so much the importance of Jesus as the Son of God who proclaims the kingdom of God, but also to mark him as someone important in the world at that time. That he is a man of relevance. That they have to pay attention to him. They have to take into account what he has to say. There's no historical evidence of this whatsoever. There's no, the concern may have existed if they killed too many Jews, the people would be upset and maybe even riot. But as the history of violent insurrection was common, and that was an appropriate concern. The Jewish Revolt started because of ongoing Roman incompetence, Roman corruption, collaborationist failures, and the people who'd had enough and were desperate enough to rebel. They weren't that desperate in this period of the actual period of Jesus, but it was building up. So, the concern is to keep the people quiet. Jesus himself is not that important. He is a nuisance. His ministry had been amongst the peasants, the people living in the countryside. Coming into Jerusalem, he was obviously trying to make a point. But the consequence of that point, no one really knew at this point. So, Luke wants to establish the importance of Jesus as a figure of relevance in this world. That people are concerned about what happens to him, and there's also the unease that they might be getting rid of an innocent man. And this once more, this is like, in the sensibilities of people like Pontius Pilate, King Herod, many of the Jewish elites of this time, elites in general, Roman, Greek, whatever, is that people like Jesus don't matter. There's plenty more where they come from. So now we come to the figure of Pontius Pilate. Historically, Pontius Pilate was a Roman official. He probably had served in the Roman armies. We don't know anything about his background, but someone who was operating in the Galilee and Judea in the 30s Common Era, he probably had some military experience wherever in the Roman Empire. It could have been in North Africa, it could have been in Asia Minor, might even be on the German frontier. We have no idea. But he would have seen service with the Roman legions. So he had probably some military experience. He had worked in this region for a while. He developed a ruthless reputation for violence. He had engaged in suppressing a variety of religious uprisings in Galilee and Judea. He had been responsible for the death of thousands. Eventually, his career ends because he was too violent. That should give you pause for thought, that a Roman official would be considered to be too violent, and so violent that actually be recalled from duty. That is like, whoa. Okay. So, a career of violently enforcing the Roman peace. He would not have been in Jerusalem for the whole year. He would have been, he would have lived in one of the satellite cities. I Capernaum, maybe the one, but he would have lived in one of the kind of Hellenized cities, the more comfortable environment for him. As I remember, as one scholar puts it, when he arrives in Passover, in Jerusalem in Passover, he would already be in a bad mood. This was not the part of the job he loved. Violent, aggressive, corrupt. So why do we have this vision of this, the historical version of Pontius Pilate, and then this vision of the Gospels, where he's like, hand-wringing, he wants to hand off responsibility over someone else, and it's not my problem, this is your problem. And why this vacillation? When, as I said, more than likely, Pontius Pilate didn't have anything directly to do with the execution of Jesus. He would have issued probably a standing order saying, if there are any signs of dissent, any signs of resistance, nail him to a cross by the end of this sentence. Don't, you have the authority of Rome to make it happen. So why? Why this kind of massaging of the character of Pontius Pilate? Because the future of the Christian faith was with Rome. And then you have a bit of an awkward situation. If your future is with Rome, how do you work in from the reality that your leader was executed by Rome? As a Roman, could you follow the Son of God who'd been executed as a threat to the Pax Romana, the Roman peace? What do you do with that? Especially when your faith is part of how you live your life, that you're no longer expecting the immediate return of Jesus. It's now Christianity in the day-to-day part of your life, as a Roman subject, Roman citizen, or enslaved person in the Roman Empire. How do you square that circle? One thing you do is that, yes, Jesus was executed as a process of Roman law enforcement, but it wasn't really the Romans' fault. That they were acting on the behalf of the Jewish authorities. This is not an historical fact. That the Jewish authorities may have been involved in some capacity in the arrest of Jesus is a possibility, probably a strong possibility. Did they have anything to do with his execution? No. Now, they may have been involved knowing that once they handed him over to the Romans would execute him. I think that's a safe bet. But the historical record is clear that the execution of Jesus is a Roman act, and Rome is responsible. The charge itself, King of the Jews, Rome was acting to ensure that no one else would get any ideas about being King of the Jews. But historical reality is awkward. And so that's why we have this whole, particularly in Luke, and then we have all these conversations between Jesus and Pontius Pilate and John, like what is truth and all this kind of stuff. And then, in later traditions, we even have like Pontius Pilate's wife having dreams, trying to tell Pontius Pilate not to do this. This is this is all part of a construct to shift responsibility from the Romans onto the shoulder of the Jewish community. That the hero, Jesus, the hero of Roman Christianity, could not have been killed by the Romans. That he was killed in the orders of the Jews. And I hope I'm kind of given a sense of this is one of the great tensions in Christianity, and it's something often comes up this time of year. Like I'll just make a point. I was reading through the scripture passages and for Palm Sunday, and one of the Psalms, I think Psalm 118, has a verse which is a very popular verse, the cornerstone, which was rejected as being the corner of the foundation. It's one of those verses that when you suddenly look at the new light, it's actually quite terrible. because what it relates to, what it's been, the original meaning of the psalm is not this. The psalm was written way before any of this happened, but now it can be seen as Jesus has been rejected by the people of Israel, but he has become the new corner, the new foundation of the covenant between God and the people, and hence revoking the first covenant. That is not what happens. I cannot stress that enough. We call that supersessionism. This idea that the Christian covenant has replaced the Jewish covenant. That is not what has happened. And even Paul himself says that. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, talks about the Christian covenant being grafted on. However, for many Christians, that is the belief, that the Jews are being punished for rejecting Jesus, and in one way of their punishing is the ending of the covenantal relationship between them and God. That is wrong. I bitterly oppose that in any opportunity I get. I'm annoying about that on Twitter. But this is where it comes from. It comes from in the Gospels. So that's the kind of the grand picture of the gap between the heroic narrative and the historical narrative. I want to move in a little bit into the personal. And I'm going to use the scene in the garden, or Gethsemane. And this will take about 10 minutes, and I think we'll wrap it up at that point. I have some notes here, some bits and pieces of notes. I'm going to make sure they'll be available for anyone who wants them, because one of the things that also might be useful to look at is Jesus's last words. What does Jesus say when he dies? The different Matthew and Mark, he says the same thing. The Gospel of Luke is different. The Gospel of John. Maybe that'll be another conversation. Maybe we should save that for another conversation. Anyway. So Jesus in the garden, and that's what we'll do this for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then maybe have a 10-minute session. When I put up my hand like this, I will wrap things up, and if we want to have a conversation for about 10 or 15 minutes afterwards about what we've talked about, would be great. So once we see that sign, go for the conversation. Anyway, so in the garden, first of all, John doesn't even mention, John doesn't have a scene in the garden. He has this long, rambling sermon from Jesus. In fact, Jesus's last night, part of the Gospel of John, is very profoundly different from Mark, Matthew, and Luke. There is a meal, but it's not the kind of meal that we're used to celebrating. He washes the feet of his disciples, and then he goes into this long, detailed last sermon, and then he's arrested. And the way he's arrested, he's in charge of the whole affair. But what we have, Mark, as I've mentioned before, is the source gospel. And Matthew, almost word for word, follows Mark's version. I confess, to me, that the description of the garden scene in Mark's gospel is one of these moments when I'm drawn to Jesus Christ. The suffering, the doubts, the struggles to be faithful to what God wants from him. He doesn't want to do this. Personally, he does not want it to end this way. And his willingness to be open before God, to open up his heart to God and say, I don't want to do this. Pass the cup to someone else. To me, it's a powerful scene of the struggle of Jesus to be the Son of God, and yet at the same time as one of us. To struggle with the implications and the consequences of his actions, and at the same time not want this. I think it does have the feel of being true. Mark's account, and maybe this is another piece of where Mark is a possible eyewitness. Maybe Mark actually saw this, and maybe Mark wanted to write it down, this personal struggle of Jesus, because in many ways, it is not the Jesus we're familiar with. This is a Jesus like us, filled with doubts, filled with fear, who doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to take this actions. So maybe we do have Mark the eyewitness. Because what we have in Luke is a very different version. You know, the hero's narrative. We have the struggles. And then we have the angel filling him with strength. And then we have he's so anxious, he's crying tears of blood. It's a bit melodramatic. Like, you go from the very human, tense, struggling Jesus to this kind of like, it's almost like a performance. Someone who knows that God is with him. Someone who knows that God's going to support him in all this. And that not to lessen the impact of what he's doing. But in Mark, we have this sense of someone who wants to know what's going on. And that may well be reflected in his last words as he dies on the cross. God, God, why have you forsaken me? Whereas in Luke, we have angels, we have melodrama. And his last words are, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. I don't know if it's a direct connection between those kind of events, but I think what we do have in Mark is a possible historical moment, an historical example of Jesus as a human being, as one of us, fearful of what happens next, willing to follow the will of God, to take these next steps, but desperately hoping that someone else can do it instead. With Luke, it's all part of the hero's story. The hero's story has miraculous events happening. It's interesting because, Mark has miracles and whatever, but, they're just like part of the background. But here with Luke, we have this scene of angels, blood, tears, and all this kind of stuff. So I hope I have done a fairly good piece of the historical narrative, the historical what probably did happen, and then the overlay of what the gospel tries to do. At the heart of what the gospels are, remember, I think this was in the TV show From Jesus to Christ, that one of the things they talked about was the purpose of the gospels is to tell the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's the main event, because that is the story that they want people to come away with. They bring in the teachings, they bring in the miracles, but to them, it is the story of the transformation of the resurrection. This is the most important event in Paul's letters. He doesn't mention much about Jesus' teaching or anything like that. So the death and resurrection of Jesus is the main narrative to be told. There are historical details that don't match, and they're often part of the kind of the complex involvement of Christianity, its place in the Roman world, factionalism within the Jewish community, and variety of things. The Jesus who goes to Jerusalem to be the hero that will renew the world. How much that has in common with historical reality, we don't know. We do know that something happened, he was executed, tomb was empty. We can have a strong sense of Jesus knew how important things were going to be by establishing this Last Supper as a community ritual to celebrate the kingdom of God amongst the community once he was gone. The resurrection, a transformative experience happened in the community that led them to want to share good news with the rest of the world. The death and resurrection, the narrative of the death and resurrection of Jesus becomes part of that story. It's the foundational part of that story. What meaning it has for us today, it's still one of the cornerstones of Christianity. and yet there's also problematic, as I've mentioned. How much do the historical details matter, and how much does what the Gospels add on? Once more, it's a complicated situation. So I hope I've given a good overlay of that conversation. And maybe I'll just close with a couple of sentences before I lift my hand up, as it were. To what end have I done all this? What's the point? For me personally, the point is the historical narrative at the heart of all this indicates that Jesus was aware of something big was happening. He was taking steps into a new stage of the relationship between God and humanity. That he wasn't sure what that looked like. That he struggled with what that looked like. And yet was still willing to go ahead with what was happening. To me, that is very much still part of my faith. That's why I'm a Christian. I am troubled by some of the aspects of the later editions of the gospel stories, particularly the anti-Jewish aspects. I understand where they're coming from, but at the end of the day, it doesn't, for me, undermine what my faith is, that through the death and resurrection of Jesus, the world was transformed. A new vision of relationship between God and humanity was initiated. Didn't replace anything. It was an addition to what had already went on. And so that's why this all has meaning to me. So that's my final words, and I'm going to go up like that so we want to have some questions at this time, and we've got maybe 10 minutes or so, we can do that. So anyone got any thoughts, questions, concerns, declarations of heresy? You're responsible for why Christianity is collapsing?
I don't know that I believe that Christianity is collapsing. Christianity, in my opinion, has always been co-opted by the people in power who want more power and want to use any religion for power. And you saw that even back in the world of Jesus with the wealthy Jewish folk wanting power and working with the authorities to make sure that, when the authority changed, whoever came through with the next most powerful army, they would still have power. And so we hear histories of Christianity being this tiny, tiny group of people who are dedicated to this notion that we could be nicer to one another. It is so hard for people to grasp, and that it's the small group that is the seed. It's a little like, I'm feeling a little like there's a phoenix in here, right? And it grows a little too big and people want too much power, and it flashes into flame and draws back. But there's a seed planted in that flame, and it grows again. And so I don't think that Christianity is collapsing in my idea here. I'm really grateful to know more about that element of the narrative stories being part of the origins of Christian anti-Judaism.
Yeah.
And understanding that better is useful, because I've never understood it before. And now knowing some more of the history, I'm like, okay. Yeah. So grateful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I'll just kind of follow up with that one of the, we hear in some church liturgies, they've actually started changing the words of the scriptures. So like the Gospel of John in particular, instead of using the Jews, they say the Jewish leadership, such and such. Now, the problem with that, however, is it takes out the sting of the anti-Jewish rhetoric that we hear, but at the same time, it kind of almost like nullifies the original intent, and maybe we need to know the original intent. We need to know that the Gospel of John is a profoundly anti-Jewish work. It's not Jewish authorities it's against Judaism.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of one of the tensions that we have. I very rarely use the Gospel of John at this time of year because it's just so difficult to work with. Like I just throw my hands of it.
Mhm. Yeah. Sandy,
Yeah.
I apologize if you did mention this, but the differences, the quite remarkable differences between Luke's version and Matthew and Mark's, is that primarily to do you think, with the audience that he was speaking to?
Yeah.
So more the Gentile group.
The one of the, and I'll give this a little bit piece of background. It's a question of literature. There was a style of racy novels in the Hellenistic world, in the Greek world. They're real pop burners, like love triangles, mysterious monsters, and identities, and whatever. The speculation is that Luke was influenced by this, and so Luke is writing for a Gentile audience. Now, there's two strands to look at. First is the appealing nature of Christianity to the Gentile audience. How do you appeal to the Gentile audience that is Roman and whatever? So he has to do some interesting work, whatever. Also, he wants to write a good story. So he throws in details, he throws in scenes that Mark and Matthew would be like, what the hell? Like, what's this business of Jesus weeping tears of blood? Like, come on, calm it down, tone it down. And I'll just quickly go an example that in this week's sermon, the question of the nard, the perfume. Luke takes that story, puts on a different part of the gospel, and has a completely different message. And it's all about sinfulness and the like. It's nothing to do with, and so Luke is very much wanting to keep people's attention. He'll throw in some interesting background details. He'll throw Jesus hobnobbing with the rich and powerful just before he's about to be executed. It's like, what's that? And so it is a question of audience, and it's also a question of style. Literally style. I understand that Luke is often used Luke in the Book of Acts is often used as a teaching tool for people who are learning the Koine classical Greek because of the style they're writing. Whereas Mark's Greek is absolutely atrocious. Apparently, it's just like it's clunky and like whatever. Maybe it's one of the reasons why I like it. So Luke is a different audience, and he also has a different style, and he's more entertaining.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's the key point. One of Mark's goals is to entertain you. Luke's goal. Mark's goal is to tell you Jesus is the good news. Get with the program. Matthew's news is we're right, they're wrong. Get with the program. John is we're right, everyone else is wrong, but we're special and we're right. Luke is I've got an awesome story to tell you. I'm going to throw in as much fun as possible. And when we get to the Book of Acts, I'm really going to go to town with the fun. So if you're going to make a film version, Hollywood makes the Luke version.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Maybe I've got it wrong, but it kind of going on from what you're talking about, but it sounds to me like these men were older men by the time they told their stories, in that if you said it was like 25 years past, is it a case where they waited until they themselves had more status, more
I think so,
position,
yeah.
more power in life, and then were able to sort of tell this story? And if that's the case, then in other words, why didn't they and maybe why did that take so long to come out? But also, I think the whole thing shows that it's such a human tale, that it's human nature. Patterns of behavior are always repeating themselves. Like there's betrayals, there's lying, there's elaboration. manifestation of a different way of this and that. It's everybody challenging power. So you sort of see this the scenario of the whole Rome and Jesus thing. This has been repeated over and over again. Like I sort of was thinking, not that there's anything like it, but when you think of like the rise of Gandhi and even Hitler, is that whole idea, the fear of something overrising. I don't know. It's an interesting take that, in a sense, I guess when I go to church, I don't sit there and think of, okay, Christianity as what it grew to become was actually at one time sort of a bit of a challenge to a political empire. Is that correct? Yeah.
There's a interesting alternate history short story, and it talks about the Germans win the Second World War, and they're occupying India. And Gandhi says, okay, we're glad you got rid of the British. I assume you're going to make us independent. And the Germans say, are you crazy? And so they crush the Gandhi movement, and they actually kill Gandhi and this kind of stuff. And at the end, and these are German soldiers, they're Christians, quote unquote. And there's one German soldier says to him, have I just become Pontius Pilate? You know, and it's, you know, and to come back to the kind of the first point you made, one of the things that happens is that one of the reasons these stories get written down is because Jesus hasn't returned.
Okay, so they waited.
They've waited for Jesus to return. It's not happening.
It puts more believability into it. Yeah.
Well, it's also they're in it for the long haul, and it's like if you're in the religion for the long haul, you need your narratives, you need your mythologies, you need your stories to keep you going. And so there's the oral tradition. You know, the oral tradition is 3-generation reach back, which means that, and I'll use myself as an example. Karl Barth is one of the great theologians. I have an oral history reach back to Karl Barth. My professor at seminary, Martin Ramscheid, was a student of Karl Barth. So any stories he tells of his experience, to me, I can then pass on to the next generation, and they can still be fairly, considered to be an accurate source, with the old proviso that when I tell a story, I might add in some more details. But say the person I tell the story to tells it to someone else, you're beginning to lose the focus. So when the people start to write the stories down, they're beginning to, they don't want to lose the focus, but they're already adding in extra detail. They're already actually adding in little moments. They kind of add local spice. And Luke in particular is very good at that. Like when you get to the book of Acts, there's acts of little, like this, that, and the next thing. It's like, okay, where's the meat? So yeah, there's a need to get things written down. There's a need to establish a narrative that will get people. There's also tension within the Christian community. There are many Christians who do not accept this narrative. At this time of the Gospels, there are Christians who do not believe in the importance of the resurrection. There are those who believe that Jesus teaches. That's important. Others who believe in the secret wisdom. A group of Christians decided that the death and resurrection should be the central focal point of all Christians. And this is one of the reasons why the Gospels were written down.
Okay. Andy, is there an element that as they started on this journey, building the church, that we're waiting for Jesus to come back, so nobody needs to take the time and effort to write it down because we're all going to be here when he returns? And then as time goes on, there's that moment where you think, well, when I die, the stories that are in my head will be lost. I better write this stuff down. And so you get some of that stuff written, and you'll see it on the library and bookstore shelves right now. People who lived through the Second World War have been dying in their 80s and 90s now. And so many of them have decided to write a memoir or a story about what they lived through. And so in book clubs right now, there's that point where you say, okay, we've read about 15 books about the Holocaust. Maybe it's time we could read something a little lighter.
Yeah.
And we've had conversations about why there are so many books about the Holocaust right now. And it's because these folks they're in the running out of time to get their
Exactly.
stories recorded for posterity and for just the overwhelming weight of reality. If 500 to 1,000 people are telling the very same story, then the deniers,
True. Yeah.
eventually have to be over. And we'd hope that they would eventually not be deniers. And so I see that in this bit, and you wonder how many gospels were written. And then the editor folks who chose what went into the Bible, and this one's in and this one's out, and see how that worked. And so the stories that we have captured in the Bible are some that a group of people said, yeah, these are the right ones that need to be here.
And I think
Their
that
lifespan was much shorter, so that sounds
Yeah.
about right. 25 years later, yeah.
and the key point about the canon, the Gospels, is the gospel, for a gospel to be included, it had to have the death and resurrection of Jesus. If it didn't have that, for the people who were setting up the canon, don't bother. It's not relevant. And so that's why you don't have like the Gospel of Thomas and others. There was an early Christian leader by the name of Marcion who was a profound anti-Jew, and he wanted to establish the canon as just some letters of Paul in the Gospel of Luke. He didn't want the Gospel of Matthew because it was too Jewish, and so there's a sense that you need your documents, you need your story to maintain the existence of the Christian community so they can have something written down. This was one of the things that Christians were actually quite valued during the Roman Empire. It wasn't all just persecution. In fact, in many cases, there wasn't even persecution. But many Christians were literate because Christians had to read and understand, the Christian leadership had to read the Bible. They had to be able to read the Bible and, share the stories. And so when later on, when the Christians were being persecuted by some Roman officials, many in the Roman community are like, what the hell? That's our literary people. They're the ones who know what's, we need them. You can't just suddenly kick them to the curb. So this is part of the tradition of the Jewish tradition that Christians have very much part of their language of the word, the religion of the word. And you're right, this idea of we need to write the story down before it gets lost. And the difference between like Paul will mention details such as the Last Supper simply because he wants to make a point that you're wrong and I'm right. He's not writing it down for posterity. He's trying to win an argument. And that's why I think that's why it's more of a valid historical point, unless he's lying to win the argument. I suppose that's also a possibility, like, oh yeah, this is what actually happened. Just don't check the details. Whereas later on, the narrative becomes part of the story to make a point about Christians that didn't exist at the time Jesus was around. As I've said before, the tensions between Jesus and the Pharisees were more the tensions of people who enjoyed a good argument. They were not the tensions of people trying to destroy one another. That's Matthew's world. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Well, I
was just going to say, I thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, Cindy. Always interesting.
Oh, my pleasure. And I'll have the notes available. They're fairly scattered and they're bits and pieces all over the place, but for anyone who wants to have a look at them, I'll put them on the Facebook page, and I'll send them to Rena. So if Rena does a mail out, then she can just attach this as a document, whatever. So we'll go from there.